Okay, I don't think there's anyone else in the waiting room, so we can just kind of kick it off. We can start, I think, now. I have a couple things to say before we hand it over to Julia for our keynote address, which I know we're all so excited for. So I'll make it short. I just wanted to say, first of all, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Friday morning to celebrate some of the awesome work that's come out of the English department this year. I know it means so much to all of us. My name is Avery Farren. I'm a graduate student here at DePaul studying writing and publishing, and this is my colleague and good friend Anna. She's over here in my screen, so I'm doing this. I don't know if she's there in your screen. Anna Gerwig, who is also in the same program, the MAWP program, and we are the coordinators of this year's conference. So welcome. Over the past 4 months, we've had the incredible privilege of reading some outstanding, inspiring, and world-expanding work that our peers have created during the 2020-2021 school year in order to cultivate the pieces for this year's conference. And let me just say, you're in for such a treat. Every piece that we've received has just showcases a different realm of thought and brings forth perspectives that we've never experienced in new and inventive ways. So we hope you'll join us throughout the day for our 3 panels following this event this afternoon. The schedule is, I put it in the chat. I think that it has all the Zoom links in there. You don't need to send another RSVP, like all the links are there. So feel free to pop in and out as the day goes on. But I just wanted to briefly, lastly, speak on the year that we've had as students and as faculty, because it's kind of like the white elephant in the room. There's probably nothing I can say that hasn't already been said like 1,000 times over. So I'm not going to use the whole now more than ever unprecedented times thing. But truthfully, it's been one of the most trying and turbulent years as students that we've ever experienced. But as creators, which most, if not all of us are, the consistently shifting political, social, medical climate through so many wrenches into what is otherwise methodical writing processes. So, but as you'll see this afternoon, these writers and scholars didn't allow what otherwise was a year of confusion and conflict to stop them from doing what they love and what they do best, which is writing. And for these students, writing, literature, poetry, research, documentation, all of these wonderful schools of thought did not stop when everything else seemed to. And it's been such an honor and a privilege to read the work that these brilliant writers have created during some of the hardest and darkest times in our collective memory. So it kind of makes me emotional, actually. So before I start to tear up, because I could talk about this forever, but it's my absolute privilege, and oh my gosh, I'm so excited to announce the commencement of the 2021 English Conference, and more importantly, to introduce our impeccably talented and accomplished keynote speaker. She is the author of the critically acclaimed debut novel, What Should Be Wild, which was shortlisted for both the Bram Stoker Superior First Novel Award and the Chicago Review of Books Award. And her most recent stellar novel, The Upstairs House, was released in February of this year, and I had my copy and I left it at my office, so it's not here anymore. I was gonna like pull it out and be all like cool and professional about it. Kind of just drop the ball on that one, but that's okay. But please welcome writer, novelist, Miss Julia Fine for our keynote speaker.
There we go, unmuting myself here. Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Avery. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, DePaul English Department in general. Yeah, I'm really honored to be here and thrilled that you asked me to speak. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about genre, which I guess if you've read my work isn't a huge surprise, but I want to talk about genre in a slightly different way than you all might be familiar with it. I want to talk sort of about genre as expectation and what that means both for sort of all types of writers, genre, the way we talk about it in the field of composition, genre as we can sort of relate that to creative writing and particularly fiction writing, and then also sort of the ways that genre expectation can impact promoting and marketing your work and sort of being an advocate for your work. So as a lot of you probably know, as you know, students who have studied first year writing, I'm sure some of you have taught first year writing, in the academic field of composition, the term genre isn't used for a type of story in the way that we sort of think of it. It's not, scrolling through Netflix, looking at thriller, comedy, romantic comedy. We talk about, when we use the word genre in composition writing, the field of composition, we talk about genre as a specific type of writing. So for example, an email would be a genre, a resume is a genre, grant writing is a genre of writing, literature review, a syllabus, even a novel is a genre of writing. So poetry is a genre, of course, creative nonfiction is a genre, and in a lot of writing master's programs, the genres are fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry, but we can really expand that and look at all types of writing and the ways that genre works in that way. So what we mean when we refer to genre in these ways is the expectation of form. So every different genre of writing comes with implicit instructions on how to write within it. So not to use slang in a resume in the same way how to format it physically on the page in a way that makes its purpose obvious to the reader. So you'll include your address, you'll include your work experience, your skills, and a fairly informed person who sort of has lived in the world and interacted with different types of writing can pick up a resume and understand immediately this is a resume. It looks sort of visually like a resume. It has certain types of content. And at the same time, if you are somebody who is setting out to write a resume, you immediately have a field guide to the form. So it's operating in two different ways, both for the reader and for the writer. Sort of the form is impacting how you read and also how you write. So if we think about genre fiction in that way, we can think about genre fiction as offering novelists a field guide to a form. So if you think about genre, it could be horror, it could be sci-fi, even literary fiction is basically a series of building blocks, a series of sort of instructions and recognizable features that are structured in a consistent way. So if you think about a murder mystery, you always sort of reveal the killer at the end. In a romance novel, the two, often they hate each other at first and then they get together and then there's a like a hiccup. And then by the end, there's a wedding or at least, a kiss. And so when you're writing strictly within a genre, you have that blueprint laid out for you to follow. And you also have the added bonus of your reader's expectation of the form. So just like with a resume, you have as a writer, okay, this is my romance novel. Here are the beats that I'm going to hit. And as a reader too, okay, my reader who picks up the romance novel understands what a romance novel is. You just sort of essentially know through cultural osmosis what this genre is and what to expect out of it. And of course, if you're a reader of a lot of different romance novels, that's also going to impact sort of what you think when you pick up a book. And so a lot of writers get asked who their work is in conversation with. And I actually really love this term, in conversation, because I do think that as writers, whatever you're doing is necessarily going to be, whether or not you are consciously doing it, you're sort of interacting with the work that you have read, and you're taking what you've read and sort of churning it around and coming out with something new in response to it, even subconsciously. So when asked that conversation, though, it is sort of like, what other writers were you reading or thinking about while you were writing? What impacted you sort of in what formative experiences have you had with other work? And if you're writing in a genre, and I would argue that all of us are writing in a genre, even if you think that you're writing sort of like literary fiction, that is its own genre. You're in conversation not only with the books that you read while you were formulating your ideas or before you started writing or while you were writing, you're also in conversation with sort of the whole history of that form. So you may not have read Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, but if you're writing a Gothic story that features generations of family tragedy in a big house in the middle of nowhere, you're talking to that book, even if you haven't read it. And you don't have to have read it. There's no hard and fast rule that you must read everything within the genre that you're writing. And that is just technically impossible to do. And you can't expect that of your reader, of course. But you still are sort of, because of the way that our culture functions, the way that we sort of talk about work, you're still talking to all of the books sort of that have also been written in that structure, in that genre. And when you think about the literary canon, which is changing today, when people argue for the canon, they talk about, oh, well, if we all can quote Homer and we all can reference, this one particular Shakespeare play, then we'll start from like a point of shared knowledge and conversation. And it's, instead of having to build it up from scratch every time you talk to a reader, you'll have this base of knowledge. And I would argue that genre is doing that same thing. So we don't need the canon in its traditional form. I mean, I do think there's value in all of us reading Shakespeare, but we don't need the canon in terms of like a shared collective knowledge, because we have genre and we have these storytelling forms and these forms of writing that we all can draw on, and that as readers we draw on. And so again, you don't need to have read Wuthering Heights to be in conversation with it. You don't need to, I'll admit it right here, I've never read Jane Eyre, and yet I feel I have sort of a cultural sense of that type of book and that genre of novel. And I also think it's important, even if you haven't read everything, again, not possible to read everything as a writer, you want to understand the conventions and the theories behind the genre that you're working with. And so you can sort of break this down into this, you have to know the rules in order to play the game, and you also have to know the rules in order to break them, which is a very frustrating sort of aphorism, but also I think pretty accurate when it comes to writing and when it comes to having sort of a basic comprehension of genre. So what does this mean then, this idea of genre expectation, for writers who want to use genre but want to push the boundaries? So you want to write a murder mystery, but maybe you don't want the mystery to be solved. You want to play with reader expectation by mining these elements of genre, but you don't want to feel compelled to stay rigidly within a form. And that is what I'm really interested in my own work, in my own reading. I gravitate toward work that uses elements of genre, but doesn't necessarily follow that convention and doesn't necessarily meet expectation. So I want to clarify that when I talk about genre bending, I'm not really talking about adding sci-fi elements to an epic fantasy or like a romance in space, because those are still using sort of form in traditional ways. I would say those are more genre mashups than genre benders. This is just my terminology, so if you disagree with that language, that's okay. But what I'm interested in isn't like sort of smashing two things together, but it's moving around the building blocks of various forms in unique and interesting ways that serve the goals of the work. So this could involve sort of pulling blocks. If you think about it as sort of architecture and as it's like a tower, it could involve pulling blocks from a variety of forms, or it could be just rearranging pieces of a well-known structure. So you're still relying on form itself, both as a conversation partner for your work and also as a foundation for your readers' understanding. But by bending genre, as opposed to adhering to it, you're necessarily also relying on reader discomfort. I think that as a species, we all like the familiar. And when you bend genre, you just necessarily are going to be breaking away from expectation and from what is familiar. But I also think that, it's discomfort in literature as in life that allows us to grow. So to me, that is a very important aspect of work. And I figured to give you a concrete example, I would talk a little bit about my recent novel, The Upstairs House, and what I was thinking in terms of genre and expectation and sort of the structural aspects of it, the craft aspects that went into building it. And then talk a little bit about reception and publishing and sort of what lessons, I suppose lessons I've learned, but also like ways you can think about genre in that form. So with The Upstairs House, it is a book about a new mother who has just given birth and is either being haunted by the ghost of Margaret Wise Brown, the children's author, she wrote Goodnight Moon, or she's experiencing postpartum psychosis. And at the same time, this new mother, Megan, is a PhD candidate, and she's working on her dissertation, which is about modernist children's literature in the 1930s and 40s. So sort of at a high level, the genre elements, both structural sort of genre as we generally discuss it in fiction and also genre as form. I'm looking at a thesis, a dissertation, historical fiction, looking at the life of Margaret Wise Brown, thriller elements because it's about this sort of psychological psychotic break, literary fiction because I am interested in sort of the quieter moments, attention to language, and of course horror. It's sort of a ghost story. So I'm using all of that to tell the story of a woman who is sort of in essence haunted by her past self, and her dissertation, the physical sort of form of the dissertation, becomes haunted and appears in its new form on the page. So I was using I was very interested in using that dissertation and watching it sort of morph as she changes. The actual text itself also changes. So one of the ways in which, I wanted to use that dissertation and that particular form, I wanted to make it really obvious to the reader that we were jumping from sort of a traditional first person narrative into a dissertation, and then back and forth within those two forms. And so the way that I was able to do that was using a table of contents and footnotes. It automatically sort of primes your reader for like, okay, here we are, we're getting into a dissertation. This is academic writing. Even if you're not an academic, you're still sort of familiar with the way that that looks. As I am not David Foster Wallace, you can assume I'm writing academic text by using footnotes. And then I was able to take those footnotes in terms of bending genre. I thought like, well, what do footnotes do? They sort of talk to a text, they expand on a text. How can I take those footnotes and sort of insert the narrator's psychological break and explore that through the way that her footnotes morph and change in her dissertation. So there's one form sort of right off the bat. I also was very interested in sort of looking at some of the work that the upstairs house is in conversation with. So obviously it's about Margaret Wise Brown, the children's writer. And so the expectation that a reader might have here, reading a book inspired by Margaret Wise Brown, who was a sort of modernist writer for children, is that it'll be immersive in its language, it'll be playful, there'll be color to it. There's sort of a philosophy that doesn't quite hold water because it's a little bit mystical and not, especially solid. And if you think about, the Runaway Bunny or Goodnight Moon, it has depth, but it also sort of pushes back against any sort of clarity. So that is something I had to keep in mind, and I was trying to write into as well. The other work that I saw my book as directly in conversation with, the other genres I was really mining were sort of stories of mental breaks. And so The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which is a short story from the early 20th or late 19th, I should know this better, century, about a woman who has given birth and is sort of slowly unraveling. And then The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which is about someone who is either seeing a ghost or slowly unraveling. The question of sort of like what's a haunting and what is mental illness, and how does our psychology impact our actions, which I guess is every novel ever, but this in a very particular way. So I was interested too in using not just the content of these genres, of this genre, of this sort of history, but also the form. So if you think about a book like The Turn of the Screw, which in its title sort of tells you about its pacing, it's just cranking up and cranking up. And that's also what a thriller sort of does, is it just sort of builds the tension until you finally get to a breaking point. So that was something that I was really looking at, really exploring, really thinking about in terms of how I could use genre to combine sort of this idea of haunted footnotes and also a thriller. And so if you're familiar with these works already as a reader, and you see this book as a conversation between them, your experience of my work and my novel will be different, but obviously the book itself has to stand up on its own and be entertaining enough to resonate with people who don't have that background and are not as familiar. But for those who do catch the reference, there's sort of an extra thrill. I think there's something pleasurable in recognition, even when it's the recognition of something unpleasant. So that again goes back to this idea of expectation, why genre is important, why people gravitate toward genre novels, and sort of what happens when you sort of pull the rug out from under them. So I think the same can be said of the more formal elements of genre, the composition idea of genre, where academics who recognize and anticipate sort of what's going to happen with the dissertation have a different experience than horror readers who track the build, than someone who has both of those sort of canons in mind. However, it's important to keep in mind that when the work doesn't cohere to expectation in certain ways, readers can feel frustrated. I think it's more challenging to read a book like this, not necessarily because my work itself is more challenging or because there's anything people can't access, but because they might not have been primed appropriately. They might not be sort of in the headspace to be looking at genre in this way, or they might feel so comfortable sort of in their idea of what genre is that when they read something that steps outside of it, again, like I said, it feels like the rug has been taken out from under you. So I think that's something to keep in mind as a writer. So I've heard on the Upstairs House contradictory feedback. I've heard like it's full of thriller tropes and it's such a basic thriller to this isn't a thriller at all. And I really think it's entirely based, that response is entirely based on what readers think they're getting going in. Which again brings us back to this idea of genre and what genre is useful for and what we can do as readers and also as writers. Obviously, as a writer, you have a vastly different impact than a publisher would have. But when it comes to using reader expectation to best position a book or a literary experience, because I'm not just talking about sales here in positioning, I'm talking about just sort of giving someone the best opportunity to appreciate and see what it is you are trying to do as a writer. You are kind of using some of the same tools as a publisher. So if you think about what mainstream publishing particularly does to make room for more experimental work and the way that publishing can set up a book and prep the reader, the easiest way to think about that, the easiest way to think about the way publishing uses genre expectation is by looking at covers. So obviously, marketing comes in here. It's a business. This is like, you know, the DePaul program is a writing and publishing program. So I feel like sort of this audience, more than a lot of other writers, understand how much it is a business and how much, you know, it is creative, but also sort of has a lot of other factors in mind too. So sales obviously push, you know, what covers look like. If it's a cover that looks that somebody wants to pick up, that's much more appealing. But you also have to think of covers you necessarily do as an introduction to content. I mean, we're human beings. We judge books literally by their covers. What you see impacts the experience you think you're going to have as a reader. So I thought it could be fun for us. I find it fun. I think you will too. To look at the way certain covers have changed between hardcover and paperback. So again, I apologize if this is repeat information for any of you, but when putting together a book, the marketing team, the sales team, the editor, the author, everybody gets together and picks, you know, the cover that they think makes the best sense for the book. And if it's a book that's going to be reissued in paperback, generally a year, sometimes less out, and that hardcover cover didn't really hit the way you wanted it to hit, you have the opportunity to reimagine it and find a different audience and sort of target a different group and see if making the book look different. Again, you know, it's the same book on the inside, but making it look different on the outside, providing different expectation for the reader changes its reception. So let me see if I can share my screen. Oop, hold on, I might have to. Here we go. All right, so you all see that? Awesome. So I want to start you with this cover for Adrian Peltz's Invitation to a Bonfire, which is a book about, it's sort of a riff on Vladimir Nabokov and his relationship with his wife and sort of young women helping him. It's literary fiction. If you look at it like this, you can sort of tell this looks like literary fiction. To me, it is very enticing. I look at it and I think it's going to be sort of like a dark fiction story. The title is, you know, really compelling to me. So this was the hardcover. And then over here, I hope you can still see it, is how they reissued it in paperback. So the book does take place, I think, in the 20s or 30s. And you can really tell they were pushing to me, it looks like they really were pushing the historical fiction. On the paperback cover, you look at the font they chose, the photograph, it does seem a little more accessible with the photograph. Maybe they were going for a more popular audience. But either way, you can see sort of how you might feel differently picking up the hardcover and thinking about what you're going to encounter inside versus when you pick up the paperback and think about what you're going to encounter inside. So like the expectation you have when you think about these two books. Oh, hold on. There we go. My next example is Arcadia by Lauren Groth, which is just drastically different here. The one on the left, my left at least, the colorful butterfly is the hardcover, and the sort of more serious, foreboding kind of field of sunflowers is the paperback. And this one, I think you can really see how they decided, like, we're going to really push for a more popular audience and try to broaden the scope of who is reading this book. But it's interesting to think, because if you look at the book in hardcover, you think this is going to be quirky and maybe unconventional. And then you look at the cover on the right, the paperback, and it looks much more like sort of book covers that you're used to. It looks much more like popular fiction. And so if you, again, imagine sort of your experience of Arcadia coming in sort of with the expectation that it is going to be sort of a quirky, unconventional book versus the expectation that it's going to be more popular, sort of more serious, perhaps, you just are going to have a different reading experience, no matter who you are, no matter what you've read. Another one that I just thought was kind of fun is Anne Patchett's Commonwealth. On the left, the one with the oranges, is the American hardcover, and then on the right is the UK cover. And this, I mean, I just cannot think of a better example of like sort of not of how what you see primes what you're going in for. I mean, the American cover really does look like it's going to be serious literary fiction, and the one on the right, the UK cover, looks much more commercial, much more sort of mysterious, I guess. I don't know. It looks to me a little bit like a thriller with the way that she's looking over her shoulder. But again, my point being, it just primes you so differently and then changes your reading expectation. Friends and Strangers by Courtney Sullivan. This is one that's a little bit closer, but still the paperback on the left and the hardcover on the right. You can see how they've sort of turned to the photograph and the field and sort of the people, as opposed to this sort of abstract wine drinking painting, to try to change the readership. And then that brings me to my book. So on the left here, this woman who is sitting looking into the slatted blinds. This was a proposed cover for the upstairs house. And then on the right, the house with the lady in the window is the cover that we ended up using. And so this was a really sort of interesting practical example, because writing a book that is a blend of genres really gives the publisher and me as the author sort of a lot of different ways to position it, a lot of different ways you might sort of ask the reader to come in, and what you might ask them to think of walking into the book, and so when they proposed this really gorgeous cover of the woman on the bed, presumably she's on a bed, I looked at it, I thought it looked great, but I also felt that it was not going to position this particular book in the most effective way. I think, you look at that and you expect perhaps historical fiction, you expect something sort of more serious, more literary. If you were to open that up and find, a table of contents and a dissertation with haunted footnotes, you might be a little bit confused about what you had picked up. You might feel almost resentful that the experience you thought you were going to have is not the one you're having. And it has nothing to do with the content of the book. I mean, if you feel resentful about my book, that's fine. But I do think that the pushback here would have come from sort of that breaking of expectations, and the way that genre covers as sort of like a way to prep you for genre does inform the experience of the reader. So I will unshare my screen. There we go. So obviously, as a writer, you're not the publisher. writers' goals are often aligned with publishers, but not always. Again, it's a business, but knowing your goals as a writer, I think, is useful. Knowing your goal, what genres you're looking at, what you're using, the way that you're using genre, what you want, what you think will best prepare your reader to have the best experience of your work is useful. And I also think it helps you figure out when to advocate for yourself with an agent, with a publisher in an industry that, for all of the, all that any industry is a money-making industry, I do think publishing is somewhat unique in that there are so many people out there who really care about the work itself and really want to help you position yourself in a way that will help you succeed. So yeah, if anybody has any questions about genre, about anything at all, I just hope to leave you with sort of this idea of genre as more than just the categories sort of on a bookshelf at the library, and more sort of a set of expectations, a tradition that you're writing into, something that both you and the reader can use to better communicate what it is you're trying to do as a writer.
Thank you so much for just kind of bringing to our attention all that goes into genre and how you position a story. So yeah, we're going to move into Q&A, kind of like Julia just mentioned. So if you have a question, you can like raise your hand and then ask your question. So it's kind of open now. And yeah, thank you.
I think Rebecca just asked one in the chat too. I don't know, Julia, if you can see that.
Yeah, let me pull it up.
Yeah, that's a great question to start with too. So if you can see that, that's good.
Oh, will my next book play with genre? Yes, it will. I've tried to sort of, I have tried to write a like sort of strictly one note. I hate to say one note because I feel like that makes it sound as if I'm being, dismissive of people who write within genre, but I think what it is I just like am not capable of doing it well. So yeah, I'm working on a book right now that is sort of a historical fiction fantasy type situation.
I like the sound of that. So I'll be on the lookout. But I also have a question. I loved how you're talking about like books and conversation and kind of subverting expectations. And I was wondering, as the writer, do you kind of know the rearrangement and the subversion that you're going to be pulling off in the work before you write it? Or does it kind of reveal itself as you're writing it and learning more about the books that you're conversing with?
Yeah, so I think I've written 2 books that I have, been published at this point. And I think for my first book, I understood, I guess for both, but in different ways for both. I sort of knew what I wanted to do going in. I think my first book is sort of about fairy tales. And I knew that I wanted to present sort of a more empowering take on sort of the endings of fairy tales for women. And with the second one, I actually started off thinking I really just wanted to write, a thriller that used the postpartum period sort of, which is just so easy to sort of translate in, like all of the feelings you're feeling as a postpartum parent, translate quite easily to that sort of like confusion and sleeplessness and stress of the thriller genre. And then it sort of just quickly, again, I was trying to do it straight, and I realized that the haunting was such an important element. Why not just make it, an actual haunting? So yeah, I would say I sort of have an idea for it going in, but it really takes, sometimes even a full draft to really understand what it is that's here, and that I have to work with. And then I can be much more deliberate about what I'm doing.
And then I think Michelle in the comments said, or wants to know more about the discussion with your publisher about the cover. Did they have options?
So I have a very good agent who in my contracts has made sure that I have a say in the cover. I think that there are situations in which the author basically is presented with the cover and you take it and that's what you've got. But I have an agent who it's the language I think is not, like so binding that if they were really insistent on it, I would have like legal means to change anything. But it does sort of show that, I expect my opinion to matter. And I also have an agent who sort of is very good at advocating on my behalf and helping me figure out sort of when to say something. But they presented this as an option, and I sort of immediately was like, this is a really great cover, but this is not the cover of this particular book. And they were very receptive to it. And they said, well, how do you imagine the cover of this particular book? And I think I said, I want it to be like Goodnight Moon, but for adults. And so we went back and forth. And I ultimately there's a photograph of Margaret Wise Brown at her cabin, at her summer home in Maine, that has her sort of standing in the window like that, or in sort of this door frame that leads nowhere. And I sent them that picture and I said, maybe they suggested like, let's have it be like sort of a cartoony house. But I said, I'm much more interested in having it more playful. I want it to be, I want the humor of the book to come through in the cover in a way that I didn't think that it came through in that first cover. And they were very receptive, and the cover designer was, open to it and willing. But I also, my first book also went through several cover iterations. So I think that a lot of it is, I don't know. I've had very good experiences in being able to sort of have a say in what the book looks like.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just saw Rebecca's question about the title. Yes, titles. The Upstairs House did have a different title. It was sold as Goodnight Nobody, which is a direct quote from Goodnight Moon, and we were asked not to use it. So I had to come up with a different title, but my editor actually told me I would have had you change that title anyway, because it sort of closes the book off to someone who isn't familiar with Goodnight Moon and is like sort of confusing in a way that the Upstairs House, I guess, is less confusing. No, but I definitely think title impacts genre expectations. The easiest way to think about this is like how all the YA titles are like a story of this and that, or Bones and Mist, or what, and I think that a lot, like I would imagine that when the author is writing the book, they're not like, oh, here's the title, let's write about it. I think it's more sort of like, okay, for marketing, how can we set this book up so that people know what they're getting into? So with the Upstairs House, I did love Goodnight Nobody. I was very attached to it. I'm still fairly attached to it, but it was just not going to happen. And I liked the way the Upstairs House sort of operated on both a literal and a psychological basis. And so I think it does sort of imply a haunting. I think it sort of implies something psychological if you sort of slow down and think about it. But yeah, I think if you start to look at titles and covers and the ways that books are sort of set up, because again, the title is something that the publisher ultimately has the final say on. And I know a lot of people whose books have had their titles changed in production. But you'll start to notice sort of the ways in which a title does impact sort of what you expect. What do I love about Gothic novels, and what are my favorites? I'm all about atmosphere. I really just love the way Gothic novels in general give you a really wonderful sense of place that then reflects, it's not just that you feel like you're in a place, it's that you're in a place that reflects plot or character or sort of the psychological aspects, the philosophical aspects of the book. My favorite Gothic novels, I love Sarah Waters. Although I would argue sort of her, I don't know, she's another one who I think bends genre pretty well, although she does it, I think, much more accessibly maybe than I've been able to do so far. But I love Sarah Waters. I love Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is a really great one. Other favorite, Shirley Jackson is wonderful. that's what comes to mind off the top of my head. I'm sure I'll think of more when we get off of this. I get off this call and I'll think, oh, I wish I had said so and so.
I actually have a question, Julia. I'm in a class right now where we're talking a lot just with each other about the conversation, and I know we're talking about a lot about conversations between literature and other things, like conversations between literature and the culture in which the time that book or that piece is written, and how everything is kind of a reflection of the time or a reflection of culture at that moment. And I don't know, I just wanted to hear your opinions about that. Like, do you think it's possible to write a book that is, or a piece of any kind that is separated in some way from, I don't know. Do you have a
Yeah. No, I don't think you really can, because you live in the world. And so necessarily your experience of the world, even if you're writing about, even if you're writing historical fiction, the lens that you're going to be viewing all the research you do and what you're writing is still going to be sort of contemporary. And I think it's super interesting too to look at the way, sort of if we're talking about publishing, the way the publishing timeline is so long. And so if you think about, like, say, a book maybe that would have sold like before the election of Donald Trump, it would read really differently, but then it would come out afterward. And so I think you also have to sort of like have that lag on work too, and like keep in mind that some of the things that are being written, like somebody I was talking to had a book, I remember, that came out in like last April or something, and they were like, I don't know how you didn't write about COVID in this book, or well, of course not, because you can't, like, it takes a long time to write a book. And so it's interesting, like, on both fronts of like what is sort of a steady cultural influence, and then also how sort of these like little chunks of time, haha, pandemic, but the way that sort of more contained experiences can like pivot the way that writers look at their work and the way that people are writing. And I do think, like 2016 was a really huge sort of fulcrum for the way that a lot of people were writing and the books that got written. But then those books came out, in like 2018, 2019. And so it's interesting to look at it in that way as well.
Thank you for answering that. That was a better answer than I could have ever thought. So that's perfect. I think we probably might ask for, if anybody has a last question, or Julia, you have anything to say before we give people a couple minutes before our first panel with Professor Borich talking about places. If anybody has any last questions, or Julia, if you have anything else to say, advice. I have no
advice. I mean, how do you alter your works from criticism you receive? Is it difficult? Do you ever reject critiques outright? Yes, that's a really good question. I would recommend, I think graduate school is interesting because the sort of workshop format means you are getting a lot of different opinions. And if you're writing a novel specifically, you're getting a lot of different opinions on something that they have not even really seen. Because if you think about a novel, is really only, it's very hard to get feedback on a chunk of a novel, because until you have the whole book and someone who's read the whole book, you can't really understand the beginning without having seen the middle and the end. So I think that workshop feedback, like, you definitely have to think about it that way and think like, this is a range of opinions, what I can pick and choose. And if I don't want any of this, I don't need any of this. I do think it's useful once you are out of a sort of multi-person workshop environment to have one or two trusted readers. Maybe it's an agent or a good friend or another writer who are approaching your work sort of generously and with the idea of like, what are you trying to do, not what are they trying to get out of it. And I think then you can know sort of like, okay, this is my person whose feedback I trust, who I know has sort of this particular project in mind in the way that I have it in mind. And then, at least if you disagree with the feedback, it's not because they're talking about a totally different book than you have envisioned. It definitely is difficult. Whenever I get an edit letter or really like any big thing, my first instinct is like, ouch, no. But I think sitting with it, giving it a little bit of time, and then if there is something that you really feel strongly about, and especially if you're working with an editor and sort of on the way to publication and you are at that point, I think it's important not to reject everything, but if there is something that you feel strongly about that like makes your book, and your editor is pushing back, like that relationship is not, they are the like overlord telling you what to do. Like you definitely can advocate for yourself. And I have had experiences where my editor said, like, let's take this out. And I said, absolutely not. Both in the first book, it was more like on a scene basis. And in the second one, it was like actual sentences where she was like, this doesn't make any sense. And I said, this sentence must stay. And we spent like, 45 minutes on the phone about it. But ultimately, like, I think as long as you choose your battles and as long as you're not just rejecting critiques because of ego, I do think, you don't have to feel like every critique you get, even if it is from that trusted critique partner or editor, is something that you have to implement.
Thank you so much, Julie. This was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
For taking time out of your Friday. This was seriously wonderful. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you all. Yeah.
I hope you guys, some, if not all of you, will join us for our next panel hosted by Professor Borich about places. So, or some other time throughout the day. Again, the schedule is on DePaulEnglishConference.com/schedule. Zoom links are there too. So we'll see you in about 7-ish minutes. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.